All right, so are you ready to dive into a really dark story?
Let's do it.
Today, we're looking at Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, using his Wikipedia entry to try and figure out how he became, one of America's most prolific serial killers.
Right? And it's,
Heavy stuff, but
yeah,
important to understand these things.
yeah. Let's
So,
start at the beginning. His early life was definitely not a walk in the park. I
right,
mean,
not great.
a domineering mother, exposure to domestic violence, and then at 16, stabbing a 6-year-old boy.
Yeah, that's like
It's a huge red flag.
a really bad sign.
Yeah, and the source also mentions he had a low IQ and dyslexia, so
Do you think those played a part in like,
they definitely could have contributed to some, frustration and feelings that inadequacy,
right,
for sure.
right.
And then this is interesting. He also fantasized about killing his mother.
Oh, wow.
So that kind of suggests a potential Oedipal complex,
Yeah.
which is something that's been observed in other serial killers.
So we're already seeing some potential psychological issues right from the start.
Right,
And then it continues with his first marriage and his military service in Vietnam.
right.
He kept seeing sex workers even after he contracted gonorrhea.
Yeah, that shows a real disconnect between actions and consequences,
Totally, yeah.
which is something you often see with antisocial personality disorder.
Right, a lack of impulse control.
Yeah, and then the Green River killings begin.
Yeah, and the number of victims is just,
Staggering at least 71.
it's crazy.
Mostly young women. A lot of them were sex workers or runaways.
Yeah, and that's something we see a lot with serial killers is that they target women who are, maybe overlooked by society.
Yeah, exactly. They're on the margins, and often they're not reported missing right away,
Right,
or their disappearances aren't investigated as thoroughly.
right.
And that gives these predators, like Ridgway, a window of opportunity.
Yeah, it's awful, but it makes sense, and the way he killed them is just so brutal and disturbing.
Oh, yeah. Strangulation often after sex.
Yep. It's just,
And he would pose the bodies.
it's just awful. And
That's
then,
all very calculated and disturbing.
yeah, and then there's the necrophilia.
Right. And it's important to understand that necrophilia is something that we see in a lot of serial killer cases.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's often linked to this need for power and control over the victim,
Even after they're dead.
even in death. Yeah, and Ridgway actually admitted to going back to the dump sites to have sex with the bodies.
Oh my God.
So you can really see how strong that desire for control was for him.
Yeah, it's a disturbing thought, for sure. And it's interesting that he chose the Green River area to dump the bodies.
Yeah, it's almost like he was...
He's marking his territory.
Yeah, exactly. Counters often pick places that mean something to them or that fit a pattern.
Right,
And in this case, the Green River area might have been like his hunting ground.
right. And 2 of his victims were found in Oregon.
Right, which makes you think he was trying to throw the investigators off his trail.
So he's trying to stay ahead of the police, and this is where it gets really interesting because Ted Bundy gets involved.
Yeah,
So the Green River Task Force is formed this huge effort to catch the killer,
right,
and then they get advice from another famous serial killer, Ted Bundy.
right. Bundy had a pretty good understanding of the criminal mind.
So you're saying they're getting tips from...
Yeah, despite his own horrific crimes,
Yeah.
he gave the task force some valuable insights into the psychology of a killer.
Wow.
And he even suggested that the killer might be revisiting the dump sites for necrophilia.
Wow. Which turned out to be true.
Yeah, exactly.
Unbelievable. So did they have any other leads at that point?
Well, they interviewed Ridgway in '83
Oh, really?
after he was seen with a potential victim,
Okay.
but he passed a polygraph test. So,
He passed a polygraph test. How is that even possible?
well, polygraphs aren't perfect,
Right.
especially with someone like Ridgway who might have psychopathic traits and is really good at controlling his responses,
So that basically had him right there.
and had to let him go.
Wow, that must have been frustrating for the investigators.
Absolutely.
So what happened next?
Well, a few years later in '88, Ridgway married Judith Mawson.
Okay.
And it's interesting because there was actually a decrease in murders during this time.
Oh, really? Do you think that's connected to the marriage?
It's possible that he needed a sense of normalcy in his life, and the marriage gave him that,
Okay.
but this calm period didn't last forever.
Uh-uh.
Mawson later found out that a piece of carpet was missing from their house.
Wait, what does a missing carpet have to do with anything?
The detectives thought that Ridgway had used that carpet to wrap a victim's body.
Oh my God.
Imagine finding that out about your husband.
Yeah, that's awful. But the real turning point in the case was when they got a saliva sample from Ridgway in '87 during a traffic stop.
Right, that's where DNA technology really comes into play.
Okay, so they had this crucial evidence just waiting to be analyzed.
Yeah, and it was just a matter of time before the technology caught up.
So for years they had the key to solving the case, but they couldn't use it yet.
Right, and in 2001, almost 2 decades after the first murders, the technology had advanced enough to do a DNA comparison.
Okay.
And the results were undeniable. The saliva sample from Ridgway matched the semen that they had found on a bunch of the victims.
Wow, so after all that time, they finally got him.
Yeah, it must have been such a relief for the investigators.
But also bittersweet because of all the lives that were lost.
Absolutely.
So what happened when they confronted him with the evidence?
Well, he knew it was over,
Yeah.
and he decided to make a deal. He agreed to a plea bargain.
So he agreed to a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty, but it did give us a chance to understand his motives and methods a bit better. What did he say in those confessions?
Oh, man, they were really disturbing. I mean, he talked about what he did in such a cold way, like it was nothing, you know? And one thing that really stood out was how he often strangled his victims from behind during sex.
God, that's just brutal. I mean, wouldn't that be hard to do physically?
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But it was more about the power for him. You know, it wasn't just physical. It was about having total control over them in that moment.
That is just horrifying to think about. And he also posed their bodies. Why did he do that?
That's a question that no one has really been able to answer, for sure. Some people think it was his way of still being in control even after they were dead, like he was arranging them for some sick purpose.
God, like a puppet master or something?
Yeah, it's scary to think about. Others think maybe he was trying to dehumanize them, turn them into objects.
So he could separate himself from the reality of what he was doing.
Right, and then there's the necrophilia. He admitted to going back to the dump sites to have sex with the bodies.
That's just sick. I mean, this wasn't just about murder, was it?
No, definitely not. It shows a really deep psychological problem, a fascination with death, and this need to have absolute power. You know, in a case like this, necrophilia isn't just about sex. It's about having power over someone who can't fight back.
The ultimate form of control.
Exactly. But he even admitted that later on he started burying his victims to stop himself from doing that. Doesn't that seem to contradict that need for control?
Yeah, it does.
It does, but it also shows how complex and messed up a serial killer's mind is. I mean, he may have known it was wrong, but that doesn't mean he could stop himself. You know, he was trapped in this cycle of violence, and his mental state was just so damaged.
It's almost like he was fighting himself, his urges, against whatever tiny bit of conscience he had left.
Yeah, maybe. And then you add in his religious beliefs. The source mentions that he was really religious.
That's so hard to understand. How could someone who believes in God do something so horrific?
It really is one of the most confusing parts of this whole thing. Some people think maybe he used religion to deal with his guilt.
Like to try and feel better about what he had done?
Yeah, or maybe it was all fake, just a way to seem normal.
It's terrifying to think that someone could be so two-faced. So let's talk about his victims for a second. He specifically targeted sex workers and runaways. Why do you think that was?
Well, there are a few reasons why serial killers often go after these types of victims. First, they're often overlooked by society. They might not be reported missing right away.
So it's easier to get away with.
Exactly. And sadly, there's also this idea that they're not as important or worthy of protection.
Which is just not true.
Right. But it can mean that the police don't investigate as hard.
It's just heartbreaking.
And then there's the psychological part. Some serial killers have this hate or anger towards certain groups of people.
So they take it out on their victims.
Yeah, they see them as representing something they hate.
And in Ridgway's case, he actually said he hated prostitutes and wanted to clean up the streets.
It's like they think they're doing something good when really it's just a way to justify their horrible actions.
So twisted. So let's talk a bit about the investigation itself. This was a huge and complicated case.
It really was one of the biggest in American history. And it went on for decades. They didn't have DNA testing back then, so they had to rely on old school methods like talking to witnesses, analyzing the crime scenes, and psychological profile.
That must have been so frustrating for them, working so hard with so little to go on. And they came close to catching him a few times, right?
They did. One time they even interviewed him after someone saw him with a potential victim,
Okay.
but he passed a polygraph test, and they had to let him go.
Wait, he passed a polygraph test? Didn't we talk about that already?
We talked about the one in '83, but this was a different time. It just shows the polygraphs aren't always reliable, especially when you're dealing with someone who's good at lying.
Wow, it's amazing he was able to get away with it for so long. But the investigators never gave up. They kept trying to find him.
Yeah, they were really dedicated. They kept track of every little piece of evidence, every lead, even when things didn't pan out. And it was that dedication that paid off in the end when they finally had the DNA technology to link him to the crimes.
Which brings us back to the DNA evidence and his eventual arrest. Okay, so we're back, and we've talked about Ridgway's really messed up mind and all the awful things he did and how the police worked for years to try and catch him. It's crazy that he got away with it for so long, but like we said, the investigators never gave up.
Yeah, they were really amazing. I mean, they were dealing with someone who was really smart and planned everything out. And on top of that, they didn't have the technology we have now, but they still kept collecting evidence carefully because they knew that one day it might help them catch him.
And that's exactly what happened, right? We left off talking about that saliva sample from 1987, the one they got during a traffic stop. Who knew that little thing would end up being the key to solving this whole case?
It's wild, right? It's like something you'd see in a movie, this tiny little piece of evidence sitting around for years. And it ends up being the thing that solves one of the biggest serial killer cases ever. It just shows how important it is to be thorough and to never give up on even the smallest details.
Yeah, and then in 2001, the technology had finally caught up and they were able to compare the DNA. That must have been a huge moment for the task force to finally have proof that Ridgway was the guy.
Oh yeah, it was a big win for everyone who had worked so hard on the case for years and years. And for the families of the victims who had waited so long for answers, it finally gave them a chance to confront Ridgway and tell him what he had done.
So what did he do when they showed him the DNA results?
Well, he knew there was no way out. He knew they had him. And so he agreed to make a deal. He said he would confess to everything and take them to where the bodies were if they promised not to give him the death penalty.
We talked about how tough of a decision that was before, but what about the confessions themselves? What did he say about why he did it and how he did it?
It was really scary how detailed his confessions were. He remembered everything about each victim, like where he met them, what they talked about, where he left their bodies. It's like he'd been going over it all in his head again and again all those years.
So that's where the real value of those confessions comes in, right? Not just to get a conviction, but to try and understand the mind of a serial killer.
Yeah, exactly. He told them about how much he hated prostitutes. He said they were easy targets and that he was trying to clean up the streets. He talked about needing to be in control, how he liked to strangle his victims from behind during sex because it made him feel powerful. And he even said he felt bad sometimes, but it didn't last long, and he always ended up killing again.
It's just so disturbing to think about all that hate and the need for control and that twisted kind of regret. It's hard to imagine how someone could be like that.
It really is. And that's why these kinds of cases are so fascinating and so scary. They make us think about the darkest parts of humanity and wonder how someone could become a monster.
Yeah, but there is some relief in knowing that he was finally caught and that justice was served, even if it wasn't perfect.
Definitely. And for the families, it was a way to get some closure. They could finally bury their loved ones and start to heal.
So what have we learned from all of this, from this deep dive into the world of the Green River Killer?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that evil can hide anywhere. It can look like a normal person with a job and a family and even go to church. We have to pay attention to the signs and trust our gut feelings.
And we can't give up hope. The Green River Task Force never stopped looking for answers. They never stopped believing they would find the killer.
And they did. That hard work and the advances in DNA technology finally made it happen. It shows how powerful it is to never give up on the truth.
That's a great point. Well, this has been a really heavy topic, but an important one. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Green River Killer case. We'll be back soon with another interesting topic. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.